After I played Diablo 4, a game that couldn't really convince me of its worth of $70, I had this urge. I wanted to go back in time, into a time where games were just that, games, without being stuffed up with one monetization layer over another, a time without Twitter's sensibilities and diversity charts, a time when a company laid the groundwork for the legendary reputation they would be known for in the following decade. I wanted to play the very first Diablo, a game released in 1997, over 25 years ago, and developed by a company that back then will become known as Blizzard North. Diablo 1 is probably the grandfather of the ARPG genre, despite that it was originally planned as a turn-based RPG, until somebody cranked up the speed dial and found out that real-time combat is much more fun. What, well, was a good decision in retrospective. The game is about the little town of Tristram, whose Archbishop Lazarus awakens the demon lord of terror Diablo beneath its cathedral, opening a path to the burning hells. We as one of three heroes visit the town to investigate the situation and to make our journey into the depth of the desecrated building, fighting our way through all kinds of evils to find out what is going on and how to end it. And in typical ARPG manner, we level up and find a bunch of very useful loot on our way down. But as an important side note, I didn't play the game in its original version, but one of its mods called DevolutionX, with options that are as close to being vanilla as possible and that I can clearly recommend over playing the normal game from GOG.com, because that version had massive performance issues for me and barely ran at all. And I also played the game in the Hellfire mode and did a brief dip into its dungeon, but the content of this unofficial add-on felt so irrelevant to me that I stopped after clearing the second level or so, and then went back into the cathedral again. So I personally don't really care about the Hellfire content, and I think that many people are absolutely fine if they just play the normal version of the game, with the improvements of the mod.
Hello, my friend. Stay a while and listen.
This phrase is legendary at this point, not just because it's one of the first things you will hear in Diablo 1, but also because it marks the start of a surprisingly deep story that we as a player are able to uncover in this game. Who is Lazarus? What happened to Prince Alberic and King Leoric? And who is this evil entity called the Butcher? We find a bunch of books in the game that give us the much needed and appreciated exposition as we delve not just deeper into the depths of the 16 layers of the cathedral, but also into the town's and the land's history. On our regular journeys back to the surface, we get a chance to chat with the people in Tristram that have, to my surprise, much more character and depth than I thought. Everyone tells you about their experiences and perspectives of every new revelation we stumble upon and every new task they will give us. Deckard Cain, the smith Griswold, the witch Ada, and the little boy that demands a pay from us to just take a look at his dogshit wares. If you indeed stay a while and listen, every one of them becomes a rich personality and part of that fellowship that stayed in this cursed dark town. At the end of the game, I thought I had a better connection to the Tavern Keeper than to some of the main NPCs from Diablo 4, what might tell you something about both of those games. But it is important to say that the lore doesn't carry the game alone. But for someone who never really played the game before, together with its gameplay, it kept me interested enough in it to keep pushing forward. In terms of the visuals, it's clearly not a modern game, but could go through as an indie game with retro pixel optic. I really think it's not ugly, and therefore despite its age it can still hold up today, what again proves that art style is much more important than visual fidelity. What is funny about the animations though is that you can still see the turn-based roots of the game, so most animations are therefore kind of really stiff and show the technical limitations of their time. But again, they are also not really ugly and they feel snappy and direct, what of course isn't bad either. but that stiffness of the age of the game is also very apparent in the cinematics. That did indeed had set new standards back then and established an element that especially Blizzard games will be known for in the coming years and decades, but they clearly don't hold up anymore today. Besides that, the atmosphere in this game is really nice. It is dark, it is gritty, and also it's pretty mature. You just have to take a look at the level designs and elements like the tortured corpses or the size of the plot in this game. And in that kind of way, Diablo 1 actually felt more progressive and modern than even its youngest sequel Diablo 4, where you always have the feeling that the designers had to work around some modern sensibilities or even ESG guidelines.
You have to force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors.
And I don't know if I'm the only one, but it's kind of really nice to see that something like, for example, seductive sex demons were allowed to be what they are back then, and that characters like the Butcher actually had its Butcher room and is not just a random mini-boss encounter. So I think the atmosphere is really great and arguably also pretty thick. Wink wink. And all of what I said also goes for the sound of the game. You can absolutely clearly hear its age. But it's again by no means bad and gives the whole thing a really nice retro touch. Slaying enemies still sounds satisfying, and the sounds of loot and gold that scratch that itch of every RPG player's lizard brains, they work today as well as they did back then. And all of that is accompanied by a soundtrack that rounds off the game's experience very nicely. I mean, the Tristram theme is not as iconic as it is for no reason. Talking about the gameplay now, it is very similar to everything I've said before. It basically simply works. The addicting core gameplay loop of ARPGs had its origin in this game, and that for a reason. On our way through the cathedral, we slash monsters, we loot new items, get some gold, we level our character up over time and visit the town now and then when we finish the quest or sell the items that have no use to us, or to just buy something new from the NPCs because they regularly offer things that have actual value to us and might even be better than the items that we have already, what is not really common in modern games. And even typical elements every RPG has these days, like the random stat modifiers and rarity colors for loot, were elements that Diablo 1 established in gaming. But different to many new games, these systems actually worked very well. The stat progression on items and your character is relatively slow, but therefore whenever you pick up a new item that is better than your current one, you're gonna feel that upgrade, and you can understand it, because the stat numbers were kept fairly small. And, well, then even your character's gear progress is visually shown by slight changes of your weapons and armor's look. And therefore, it did not felt bad to finish the game with a weapon whose base damage was just in the lower double digits, and with bonus stats in the 1-digit area. I would really like to see that kind of progression more often these days, instead of games where you start with 10 to 20 damage per attack and then finish it by doing hundreds of thousands. But I have to say that I very much appreciate the added improvements of the Devolution mod, like enemies having life bars or seeing some damage numbers popping up. It just makes the fights a little bit more calculatable and convenient in my opinion. Not to mention the faster movement in Tristram, or the big stash, so you don't have to throw all your items that you want to keep on the ground. In terms of difficulty, Diablo 1 is very strict when it comes to kicking your ass, especially on the later levels. Up to that point, it feels really nice with moderate difficulty spikes in form of level bosses like the infamous Butcher or the Skeleton King. But when it came to the last portion of the game, at least my rogue couldn't take much damage, and so I was forced to drink potion after potion, while I had to keep enemies with spells at a distance. And I did also like that part of the game. But what was a double-edged sword, on the other hand, was the fact that the state of the levels was saved all the time. That means that the life of enemies stays at the current level, and they also don't respawn, so levels can be cleared, but it also saves where the enemies are whenever you leave the level. That caused several situations for me where I had to leave a level after I pulled too many enemies at once, but then when I came back, I was killed almost immediately by all those enemies surrounding me. I do indeed was able to brute force myself out of these situations by buying a shit ton of pots and spell scrolls, but if that hadn't worked, I probably had to restart the game at this point. That said, this is not necessarily a bad thing, how I found out after I finished the game, because starting a new game with one of your created characters does not delete all your gear progress, inventory, or your character levels. And so if you feel stuck at some point, may it be because of a situation like that or just simply difficulty, you could technically just restart the game, grind a few more levels and maybe some new useful items, and then, well, just try it again. Even the quests might differ in your new runs, because which ones will be available to you is as randomly generated as the levels of the cathedral and its contents are itself, so every playthrough will be different to you, at least slightly. If I had known that before I had to face the last two levels of the game, I had probably done this, because those were a chore to me. Every few enemies I had to port back, buy new potions, sell some stuff to the vendors, port back into the dungeon, kill a few more enemies, chuck potion after potion, and repeat. That enemies also were able to attack me from off screen didn't really help here for me. And even when I finally faced the great evil Diablo, I basically brute forced that one too, with a lucky situation where Diablo was stuck in a place so I could end it a little bit faster. But overall, I can't really say that I felt heroic after that, and I think the scaling of mobs, at least of the last 2 or 3 levels, was a little overdone. But one weakness of this random generation of every playthrough is obviously its, well, randomness. So if you're unlucky, you get only loot that you have no use for, or you stumble over these random shrines that affect your stats negatively. Those are especially annoying because the game doesn't really tell you what they do, and even that they do anything is something you have to find out yourself by looking confused at your character page and wondering why those numbers changed so much. I think for first playthrough it is not the worst advice to either have a guide page for those shrines open, disable those bad shrines in the devolution options entirely, or, well, just leave them out. So you just have that linear character progress by just, well, leveling up. Also, the UI of the game was sometimes a little bit annoying because playing in 1080p, the elements were very small and for my taste a little bit too small, and I didn't find a way to scale them up in the mod. That wasn't as big of an issue for text and chats with the villagers, but my inventory or the character window and my action bars and resources could have been a little bit bigger for sure. But besides that, the general gameplay was enjoyable, despite its simplicity, and as I said, especially the character progress felt so much better than in many current RPGs that are bloated with stats and stat varieties that nobody understands, and are calculated in completely untransparent ways. If Diablo 2 is just Diablo 1 and bigger and better, then I'm more than excited to play that game next at some point in the next few weeks or months. Coming to the bads and bugs, besides the mentioned glitch in the end fight against Diablo, that, well, was to my advantage, the game was technically very smooth. Probably thanks to the Devolution mod, because when I first tried it natively via the GOG version of the game, the vanilla version, it pretty much ran like shit. So if I have to mention any kind of technical issues here, then that the game was basically not playable in its native version without any modification. But besides that, being a very old game, we of course also don't have any modern bullshittery like always online, microtransactions and stuff like that that mess with your and my experience. So in that terms, nice.
Thank goodness you returned. Much has changed since you lived here, my friend.
And that brings us to the conclusion. Overall, Diablo 1, played within the DevolutionX mod, is in my opinion still a very worthwhile game that brings all fundamentals of modern RPGs to the table and even executes them better than many of its children, despite its very noticeable age and roughness. Sadly, Diablo 1 is very limited available, and unless you want to pirate the game, it seems to be pretty much only available on GOG these days, for about 7 to 10 bucks, depending if it's on sale or not. What is not super cheap for such an old game that even has technical issues if you want to play it natively. So, with that in mind, I think I would go for a 2 out of 5 here. Because despite that I did indeed enjoy the game, I doubt that it is a game for many of today's players, or a game that people would miss in their life if they had never experienced it. It is a little like time traveling. It is really nice to see where ARPGs originated from, but for most people it's probably good enough to just read about it, or watch a video about the lore of the game and the story, and then instead just go with its sequel Diablo 2 or its remastered version. But still, Diablo 1 is very much play and enjoyable, and if you are ready to spend the money and download one of the mods like the DevolutionX mod, it might be a very fascinating journey for you too, if you can tolerate all those elements that, well, come from its age. And, well, this was my review of Diablo 1 in 2023. My name is TechDrake, but just call me Techie. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, well, don't forget to hit a like, maybe subscribe, and if you want, you can also pay me a visit over at my streaming channel Techie's Tavern. Until the next time, see ya.
I have no room.
Fuck.